Clifford Hayes sat alone on the porch of the worn-down ranch house, the last glow of evening fading behind the hills. His weathered hands clutched the armrests of the rocking chair, as though the wood could somehow hold together the secrets he had buried for decades. The cicadas sang in the distance, a restless hymn of summer, but inside his chest the only sound was the heavy beat of guilt. He had spent most of his life building this place. Every fence post hammered, every acre tilled, every calf delivered in the dead of night. The Hayes Ranch wasn't just land. It was blood, sweat, and the marrow of his bones. To outsiders, it looked like a proud legacy. 800 acres of cattle land that had somehow survived droughts, recessions, and corporate vultures. But Clifford knew better. Behind the polished surface lay a truth so fragile, so dangerous, that even speaking it aloud could shatter the world of the one person he loved most, his son, Ethan Hayes. When Clifford's wife, Martha, died young, the ranch nearly died with her. Medical bills piled higher than the haystacks in the barn. Creditors circled, hungry for payment, threatening to strip away everything the family had worked for. Clifford had no savings, no wealthy relatives to call upon, no miracle waiting in the wings. He had only Ethan, just a boy then, with big blue eyes that looked up at his father as though he were invincible. Clifford couldn't let that child see the roof over his head collapse. In desperation, Clifford struck a deal. It was supposed to be temporary, just a way to buy time until he got back on his feet. The Meridian Investment Consortium, a corporate machine run by people who knew nothing about ranching, purchased the land under the Hayes name. Clifford was allowed to keep managing it, living on it, raising cattle as though nothing had changed. To the world, the ranch still looked like his. But in truth, every acre, every blade of grass, every hoofbeat on the soil belonged to someone else. Clifford told himself it was for Ethan's sake. He told himself it was the only way to keep the boy safe, fed, and proud of his father. The lie became routine, woven into daily life like barbed wire along a fence line. Years passed. Ethan grew tall and strong, carrying the Hayes name with pride, never knowing that the ground beneath his boots was leased, not owned. At first, Clifford believed he would eventually confess. Maybe when Ethan was grown. Maybe when the debts were cleared. Maybe when he could buy back the land and present it as a gift, redeemed by his hard work. But that day never came. Instead, the secret hardened inside him like stone, heavy and immovable. By the time Ethan was a teenager, Clifford had become so entangled in the deception that telling the truth felt impossible. To admit it would mean admitting he had failed, not just as a rancher, but as a father. And Ethan looked at him with such admiration, such unshakable trust, that Clifford couldn't bear to see that trust dissolve. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, Ethan would raise a glass and say, "To Dad, the man who built this ranch with his bare hands." And every time, Clifford would force a smile, the words cutting into him like knives. He hadn't built it alone. He hadn't even kept it. He had signed it away. For years, the secret lived quietly in the shadows, waiting. Clifford prayed it would stay buried until the day he took his last breath. But life has a cruel way of exposing what we most want to hide. The turning point came the day Ethan introduced Clifford to Melissa Turner, the woman who would soon become his daughter-in-law. Melissa was beautiful, ambitious, and sharp as a rattlesnake's fang. From the start, Clifford sensed something unsettling in her gaze. She wasn't looking at Ethan with the softness of a woman in love. She was studying him, measuring him, as though calculating what he might inherit. Melissa began asking questions, polite at first. "How many acres do you run here, Mr. Hayes? How many head of cattle? What's the value of a spread like this nowadays?" Clifford brushed her off with vague answers, but unease prickled in his gut. For the first time in decades, he feared the truth might crawl out of its grave. And so, the stage was set. A devoted father, a trusting son, and a sharp-eyed daughter-in-law who smelled opportunity where others saw tradition. Clifford could feel the noose tightening. The lie that had protected his family for so long was about to become the very weapon used against them. But he wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. The sun dipped fully beneath the horizon, leaving Clifford in the blue-gray hush of twilight. He rose slowly from his chair, joints aching, but spirit unbroken. For Ethan's sake, for the boy he had raised into a man, Clifford would fight to protect what remained of their legacy, even if it meant confronting demons he had spent a lifetime avoiding. Little did he know, the real battle was only beginning. The following morning, Clifford Hayes rose before the sun, as he had every day of his life. The familiar creak of the wooden floorboards under his boots echoed through the silent house. Coffee brewed in the battered percolator, filling the kitchen with its earthy aroma. The smell usually brought him comfort, a sense of routine that anchored his restless mind. But today, it only reminded him of the years slipping away. Years spent guarding a truth that now pressed harder against his conscience than ever before. Ethan, his son, was the reason Clifford had survived so many storms. Raising a boy alone had never been easy. Clifford still remembered the nights when Ethan was small, lying awake terrified that he wouldn't be able to provide. When Martha died, Ethan was just a child, and Clifford became father and mother all at once. He cooked, cleaned, fixed scraped knees, and somehow managed to keep the ranch running. Every sacrifice felt worth it each time Ethan looked up at him with those trusting eyes. That trust had become the foundation of Clifford's world, and that was precisely what made his secret unbearable. For nearly 3 decades, Ethan had believed that he was the heir to a ranch that had been passed down through generations. He wore the Hayes name with pride, often boasting to friends that the ranch was their birthright. He never doubted the story because his father never gave him reason to. But Clifford knew better. Behind every chore Ethan completed, behind every calf he branded, lay the invisible truth. The Hayes Ranch was nothing more than a shadow, a mask, a facade propped up by a deal Clifford had made out of desperation. The land was owned by Meridian Investment Consortium, a faceless corporation that saw it as nothing more than an asset on paper. Clifford could still recall the shame he felt the day he signed those papers. His hand had trembled as he scrawled his name, effectively surrendering the legacy his ancestors had built. But the alternative had been worse, losing everything, abandoning his son to a future without stability. So Clifford had swallowed his pride, told himself it was temporary, and carried the burden like a cross upon his back. As Ethan grew older, the secret became harder to keep. When Ethan left for college, majoring in agricultural science, he returned with big dreams of modernizing the ranch. He spoke excitedly about new irrigation systems, breeding techniques, and expanding cattle operations. Clifford listened with pride but also with dread, because he knew that Ethan was making plans for land that didn't truly belong to them. There were moments, late nights by the fire, long rides out on horseback, when Clifford almost confessed. He would start to say, "Son, there's something you should know," only to stop himself at the last second. The fear in his chest was too strong. He couldn't bear the thought of Ethan's admiration turning to disappointment, or worse, resentment. So he said nothing, and silence became its own kind of betrayal. The years rolled on. Ethan became a man, strong and capable, admired by everyone in town. He wore his father's values like a badge of honor: hard work, honesty, resilience. Clifford often wondered if he truly deserved a son like that, and the heavier the guilt grew, the more he buried it, hoping time would somehow erase the consequences. But time never erases. It only delays. The truth began to stir when Ethan introduced Clifford to Melissa Turner. She was polished, ambitious, and quick to see opportunities. From their very first meeting, Clifford could sense her curiosity about the ranch. At family dinners, she asked probing questions disguised as casual conversation. "How much land do you run, Clifford? Do you ever think about selling portions off? What's the market value these days?" Ethan brushed off her curiosity, too smitten to notice the calculating glint in her eyes. But Clifford noticed. He saw the way she studied the ranch house, her gaze lingering not on its charm, but on its potential. He could almost hear the wheels turning in her head, dollar signs where others saw memories. That was when Clifford began to fear that his carefully maintained secret would not survive much longer. Melissa was sharp, and sharp people cut deep. She wasn't the type to take things at face value. If she sensed even the faintest crack in the story Clifford had woven for decades, she would pry it open until the whole truth spilled out. And once that happened, Ethan's world would collapse. Clifford sat alone that night by the fire, staring into the flames as though they could offer him answers. He remembered Ethan at 10 years old, proudly riding his first horse. He remembered Ethan at 16, working cattle with a determination that mirrored his father's own youth. He remembered Ethan standing tall at his college graduation, shaking his hand with tears in his eyes, saying, "I couldn't have done this without you, Dad." All those moments built on a foundation of lies. The guilt was suffocating. Yet even as Clifford wrestled with the urge to confess, another part of him screamed to protect Ethan from the truth. He wasn't sure which path was worse, the burden of silence or the destruction of honesty. What he did know was this: the secret could no longer remain buried forever. Melissa's presence ensured that. She was the storm approaching on the horizon, and Clifford had no shelter strong enough to withstand it. As he closed his eyes that night, the weight of his choices bore down on him. He had built a legacy for his son, but it was a legacy made of glass. And when the first stone was thrown, it would shatter. The only question was, who would throw it first? Melissa Turner swept into Ethan Hayes' life, like a whirlwind dressed in silk. From the very first time Clifford met her, he sensed something unsettling beneath her polished smile. She had charm, yes, and confidence that could command a room, but there was also a sharpness in her eyes, like a hawk circling the skies, searching for prey. Clifford had spent decades reading weather patterns, knowing when a storm was coming by the curl of a cloud or the way cattle grew restless. And the moment Melissa stepped onto the Hayes ranch porch, Clifford felt that same deep unease in his bones. At first, she played her role perfectly. She laughed at Ethan's jokes, listened intently to his stories about ranching, and seemed genuinely eager to be part of his world. Ethan, blinded by love, didn't notice that her questions always circled back to the same subject: money, land, inheritance. "How many acres is the ranch again?" she'd ask lightly, sipping her wine at dinner. "Is it all deeded land, or do you lease portions? What's the cattle market like these days?" Ethan would beam with pride, answering every question as though bragging about his future. Clifford, however, sat silently at the table, chewing his food slowly, hiding the unease that twisted in his stomach. Each question was a probe, a test, a subtle attempt to measure what her marriage to Ethan might secure. Melissa's presence quickly began to change the rhythm of the ranch. She suggested renovations to the old ranch house, pushing Ethan to consider modernizing, even borrowing money to do so. "This place has so much potential," she said one evening as they walked through the worn wooden hallways. "You could turn it into a retreat, a resort even. People would pay top dollar for an authentic Western experience. Weddings, corporate events, tourism. It could all happen here." Ethan's eyes lit up at her vision, but Clifford's heart sank. He saw through her dream. It wasn't about preserving the ranch's heritage. It was about turning it into a business, a commodity. The land wasn't sacred to her. It was profitable. And Clifford knew that if Ethan followed Melissa's lead, the truth about who really owned the ranch would come crashing down. Meridian Investment Consortium had never sold the deed back. The land was still theirs, and any attempt to leverage it for loans or investments would expose the lie Clifford had guarded all his life. Still, Clifford bit his tongue. He had always believed in letting Ethan make his own choices. But the more Melissa insinuated herself into their lives, the more Clifford realized silence was no longer enough. This wasn't just about a secret anymore. It was about control. Melissa was clever in how she gained influence over Ethan. She played the doting fiancé, encouraging him to dream big, to see himself not just as a rancher, but as a visionary. She flattered his intelligence, his ambition, and most of all, his loyalty to his family legacy. "You're not just managing land, Ethan," she whispered late one night, when Clifford overheard them through the thin walls. "You're carrying history, and history deserves to grow." Those words, innocent to Ethan, were daggers to Clifford, because the history Melissa praised was a fiction. The Hayes family didn't own the land, it was borrowed. And sooner or later, Melissa would learn the truth. And when she did, Clifford knew she would use it as a weapon. The breaking point came during a heated dinner. Melissa suggested, almost casually, that they begin drafting a long-term plan for the ranch, expansion, investments, even legal structures. "We should talk about setting up trusts, maybe even restructuring ownership," she said, swirling her glass of wine. "After all, this will be Ethan's legacy, and one day, It will pass on to our children. Clifford nearly dropped his fork. Ownership. The word sliced through him like a branding iron. Ethan, caught in the glow of Melissa's ambition, nodded thoughtfully. That's a good idea, he said. Dad, what do you think? For a moment, Clifford couldn't breathe. He felt the room spinning, the weight of decades pressing down on him. He wanted to shout the truth, to slam his fist on the table and declare that the ranch wasn't theirs to restructure. But Ethan's eyes, full of hope, full of trust, stopped him cold. How could he destroy that belief in a single sentence? So Clifford forced a smile, muttered something about thinking it over, and excused himself from the table. He stepped outside into the cool night air, staring up at the stars, his chest tight with dread. Melissa had pushed the conversation dangerously close to the edge. It wasn't long before she went further. She began taking notes, calling real estate agents under the guise of market research, even contacting banks about potential development loans. Clifford discovered this when he overheard a hushed phone call. Yes, I'm Mrs. Hayes-to-be. Melissa had said sweetly. I'm inquiring about the value of 800 acres in West Texas. That was the moment Clifford realized Melissa wasn't just curious, she was plotting. The storm he had sensed from the beginning was no longer on the horizon. It was here, circling the ranch like dark clouds ready to unleash chaos. And Clifford, for all his years of silence, knew he could no longer sit idly by. Melissa had set her sights on the ranch, and she would stop at nothing until she either controlled it or destroyed everything Clifford had sacrificed to protect. What Clifford didn't yet know was that Melissa's ambition would not only expose his decades-old secret, but also ignite a battle that would drag everyone, Meridian, Ethan, and even the law, into its fiery center. The storm had arrived, and there was no stopping it. The storm finally broke on a humid Texas afternoon, the kind where the air itself felt heavy with anticipation. Clifford Hayes had lived through tornadoes, flash floods, and dust storms, but none of them matched the fury that was about to descend on his ranch. This wasn't just weather. It was the reckoning of 25 years of silence colliding with the greed of one determined woman. Melissa Turner had played her part beautifully, weaving herself into Ethan's heart and into the fragile web of Clifford's secrets. But her ambition had outpaced her subtlety. She had begun making calls, contacting investors, even hinting at joint ventures, where she would be the visionary leader. And with every step, she had unknowingly drawn the attention of Meridian Investment Consortium, the true owners of the Double H Ranch. It began quietly enough. Clifford received a call one morning from Margaret Caldwell, the formidable chairwoman of Meridian. Her voice was calm but edged with steel. Mr. Hayes, we need to meet. Urgently. Within hours, 3 black SUVs rolled down the dusty ranch road, raising plumes of dust like advancing cavalry. From the lead vehicle stepped Margaret herself, impeccably dressed, her expression a mask of controlled determination. Ethan emerged from the barn, wiping sweat from his brow, surprised at the sudden entourage. Melissa, however, appeared on the porch as if she had been waiting for this moment her whole life. She smoothed her dress, straightened her shoulders, and prepared to play the role of lady of the estate. But Margaret Caldwell wasn't here for pleasantries. Melissa Turner? Margaret's voice carried across the yard, sharp and commanding. We've been expecting you. Melissa's confident smile faltered, but only for a moment. And you are? She asked smoothly. Margaret Caldwell, chairwoman of Meridian Investment Consortium, the rightful owners of this land. And I believe you've been making inquiries that concern us greatly. The color drained from Ethan's face. Owners? What is she talking about, Dad? He demanded. Clifford felt his throat tighten. For a moment, he couldn't speak. The secret he had buried for decades now lay exposed under the harsh Texas sun. Melissa, sensing danger, tried to seize control of the narrative. Don't listen to her, Ethan, she said quickly. This is just an intimidation tactic. They're trying to bully us because they know we're planning to grow the ranch, to turn it into something bigger. But Margaret Caldwell wasn't finished. She motioned to David Chun, Meridian's attorney, who opened a briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. We have records of your conversations, Melissa, David said coldly. Your phone calls, your plans to defraud Ethan Hayes, your conspiracy to steal assets that were never his to begin with. extortion, fraud, attempted elder abuse. Quite an impressive resume of crimes. Melissa's mask slipped. Her eyes darted wildly, her lips trembling. "You can't prove anything," she spat. That was when Thomas Wright, another board member, held up a small digital recorder. "Actually, we can. Every word you spoke to our undercover investigator, recorded with full consent. And we also have witness statements from the reception, from neighbors, from business contacts you thought you could manipulate." Melissa's face hardened, but Clifford could see the cracks forming. He had seen cattle driven into corners before, panicked and thrashing, and Melissa now looked no different. Patricia Vasquez, another Meridian executive, stepped forward, her eyes cold and unwavering. "Assault against a senior citizen in front of 200 witnesses, Melissa. You put your hands on Clifford Hayes at that reception. The district attorney is already very interested in pursuing charges." Ethan's jaw dropped. "You what? Melissa, tell me this isn't true." But Melissa said nothing. Her silence was louder than any confession. The board members closed in, not physically, but with the weight of evidence and authority. David Chin placed a restraining order on the table in front of her. "Effective immediately. You are prohibited from contacting Clifford Hayes, Ethan Hayes, or anyone associated with this ranch. Violation will result in immediate arrest." Melissa's bravado finally crumbled. She slumped into a chair on the porch, her head in her hands, whispering, "This can't be happening." "Oh, but it is," Margaret said icily. "You see, Miss Turner, Meridian protects its investments, and more importantly, its people. Clifford Hayes has served us faithfully for 25 years. When you threaten him, you threaten us, and we do not take kindly to predators." The silence that followed was suffocating. Ethan stared at his fiancée, as though seeing her, for the first time. The woman he had planned to marry, the woman he had defended against his father's suspicions, was nothing more than a con artist who had seen him as a stepping stone. Melissa finally raised her head, her eyes wet but still defiant. "You can't keep me from him," she hissed, pointing at Ethan. "He loves me." But Clifford's voice cut through the air, steady and cold. "If you loved my son, you never would have lied to him. You never would have tried to steal from him. And you sure as hell never would have laid a hand on me at his wedding." Ethan turned away, unable to meet Melissa's gaze. "Get out," he whispered. "Just get out." The security team appeared in the doorway then. 3 large men in dark suits, polite but unyielding. "Time to go, Miss Turner," one of them said. Melissa's hand shook as she gathered her scattered papers, stuffing them into her purse. She walked toward the waiting SUVs, but at the threshold, she turned back one last time. Her voice was low, venomous. "This isn't over." Margaret Caldwell smiled thinly, without warmth. "Oh, Melissa, it's very, very over." And just like that, the storm passed. Melissa was driven away, her shadow finally lifting from the ranch. But the damage she had done lingered in the air like the heavy scent of rain after a thunderstorm. Ethan stood frozen, torn between rage, heartbreak, and confusion. Clifford knew the hardest part was still to come, because the fall of Melissa Turner was only the beginning. Now came the truth, the one he had avoided for decades, the one that could either heal his relationship with his son or destroy it forever. The dust from Melissa's departure had barely settled when the silence of the ranch grew heavier than ever before. Clifford Hayes stood on the porch, staring at the long dirt road that stretched into the horizon, where the taillights of her car had disappeared. He knew he would never see her again, but the shadows she cast lingered behind like a scar that refused to fade. Inside, the members of the Meridian board quietly gathered their files, their faces somber but resolute. They had done their part. Melissa was finished. Yet as they packed up, Clifford could feel the weight of their gazes, silently reminding him of the unfinished business that lay between him and his son. Margaret Caldwell was the last to speak. Her voice softened, though it carried the same authority as before. "Mr. Hayes, we need to discuss Ethan. He deserves to hear the truth from you." Clifford's throat tightened. The truth. 2 words he had spent a lifetime avoiding. And now, they had finally cornered him. An hour later, Clifford sat in a quiet hotel conference room in the city. Across from him was Ethan, still in shock, still reeling from the collapse of his engagement. His face was pale, his eyes red, his whole body tense as if bracing for another blow. "Dad," Ethan said finally, his voice low and broken. "Tell me this isn't real. Tell me the ranch is ours. Tell me she was lying." Clifford's heart cracked at the desperation in his son's voice. He wanted to lie again, just to ease the pain in Ethan's eyes. But the time for lies had ended. "No, son," Clifford said quietly, his voice trembling. "Melissa wasn't lying about that. The ranch, it's not ours. It hasn't been for 25 years. Ethan blinked, stunned. "What are you talking about? Grandpa left it to you. You told me." "I told you what you needed to hear," Clifford interrupted, his voice heavy with shame. "After your mother died, I was drowning in medical bills. I was on the verge of losing everything. That's when Meridian stepped in. They bought the ranch to keep us afloat, and they let me stay on as manager. It's theirs, Ethan. It's always been theirs." For a long moment, Ethan just stared at his father as though he were a stranger. Then slowly, the reality sank in. His chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths, and finally, his voice broke. "So my whole life, the stories about inheriting the ranch, about carrying on the family legacy, they were all lies?" Clifford's eyes filled with tears. "Not lies, son. Hopes. I thought maybe someday we'd be able to buy it back. I didn't want you to grow up feeling like we'd lost everything. I wanted you to believe in something bigger than hardship. So yes, I kept the truth from you. And I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry." Ethan turned away, his hands gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white. "Do you have any idea what this feels like? To find out that everything I believed about my family, about myself, was built on a secret?" Clifford swallowed hard. "I do. Because I've been carrying that weight every day since the deal was signed. It's eaten me alive, son. I thought I was protecting you, but all I did was build a wall of silence between us." For a long time, neither spoke. The silence between them felt like a canyon too wide to cross. But then Ethan's shoulders slumped. His voice cracked as he whispered, "I don't know if I can forgive you right now." Clifford nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I don't expect you to. I just hope, in time, you'll understand why I did what I did. And I hope you'll see that I never stopped fighting for this land for you." The days that followed were some of the hardest of their lives. Ethan withdrew into himself, processing the betrayal, the heartbreak, the collapse of his marriage, and now the truth about his family's legacy. Clifford, meanwhile, threw himself into work, repairing fences, tending cattle, doing anything to escape the guilt that gnawed at him. But slowly, painfully slowly, the cracks in their relationship began to heal. Ethan started joining Clifford in the fields again, though their conversations were sparse at first. They worked side by side in silence, letting the rhythm of the land do the talking. 3 months later, Ethan made a decision that surprised everyone. He moved back to the ranch, not permanently, but long enough to sort through the ruins of his failed marriage and rebuild his life. He started taking over bookkeeping, handling the cattle sales, even negotiating deals that impressed Margaret Caldwell herself. "Your son has sharp instincts," Margaret told Clifford during one of her quarterly visits. "If he ever decides to make an offer on the property, the board would be receptive." And then, one quiet evening in December, Ethan finally spoke the words Clifford had been waiting for. They were sitting on the porch, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and pink across the horizon. Ethan leaned forward, his eyes steady, his voice calm. "Dad, I want to buy the ranch." Clifford's heart leapt, but he tempered it with caution. "Are you sure, son? You don't have to do this because of me." "I'm not doing it for you," Ethan said firmly. "I'm doing it for me. This place, it's home. It's where Mom and I used to walk the pastures, where you taught me to ride, where I learned what hard work really means. Melissa made me doubt all of that, but I won't let her take this from me. From us." 6 months later, the transfer was complete. Ethan Hayes became the official owner of the Double H Ranch, with Clifford staying on as ranch manager. For the first time in 25 years, the deed was finally back in the family's hands. The closing ceremony was small but meaningful. Margaret Caldwell brought champagne and raised a toast. 25 years ago, Meridian bought this ranch to preserve it. Today, we sell it back to the family that loves it most. This is the ending we always hoped for. As Ethan signed the final papers, Clifford felt a peace he hadn't known since his wife died. His son was home. His son was safe. And most importantly, his son was finally in control of his own destiny. That night, as they walked the fence line together under the stars, Ethan asked quietly, "Do you regret it, Dad? Keeping the truth from me all those years?" Clifford considered the question carefully. "I regret that it made you vulnerable to Melissa's lies. I regret that it came between us. But I don't regret protecting you from the burden when you were too young to carry it. And I don't regret working with Meridian, because without them, we'd have lost this place forever." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. Then, with a faint smile, he said, "I've been thinking about Mom. About what she'd say if she were here." Clifford's voice caught. "What do you think she'd say?" Ethan's smile widened. "She'd say families protect each other, no matter what. And that home isn't about a piece of paper. It's about the people who belong there." As they walked back toward the house, Clifford realized something profound. Melissa's betrayal had nearly destroyed them, but it had also given them an unexpected gift. By tearing down the lies, she had forced them to rebuild their bond on the foundation of truth. And that bond was stronger than ever. The ranch lights glowed warmly in the distance, welcoming them home. Clifford exhaled, feeling a weight finally lift from his shoulders. For the first time in decades, he was free. Ethan was free. And the Double H Ranch, at last, belonged to the Hayes family once more. It wasn't the ending Clifford had planned, but it was the one they both needed. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't in striking back. It's in surviving, rebuilding, and finding peace in the truth.